from the telling of the story that we then identified what it is they needed help with in order to be able to move forward. But what emerged in their stories was that embedded in it, because we're all characters in our own stories, embedded in it was an identity. There was an identity which often surprised them, because their loss of their resilience was because an identity that was very important to them had been challenged in some way. And it was that they were struggling with. Because our identity, and clearly we have multiple identities, but I think loss of resilience is often linked to an identity which we hold very dear, which is challenged by an event, whether it's a work event or a life event. And the reason why identities are important is because they give us all of these things, right? So if I see myself as being a really tough manager, then the coherence is, it gives an explanation as to why I'm doing these things, why I don't have problems giving really difficult feedback, or why I'm ruthless, or why, if my identity is as the talent, right? My identity is talent, then it gives me a sense of coherence about what I'm entitled to, about how the world should treat me, about how I behave. I think the other thing about identity is when we attach to an identity, we assume that it's ongoing. So if I'm tough, I'm going to be, I was tough, I am tough, I will be tough. Right? I'm talent, I was talent, I am talent, I will always be talent. And therefore, obviously, when there's a disruption, it's a real challenge to identity. It protects who I think I am. It tells me who I am. And of course, what we also do is we look for it to be validated in others. I'm talent, therefore I expect you to reflect that back to me. Or I'm tough, and I expect you to validate, God, you're a really tough manager. And the stories that my clients brought to me when I was doing the research was that something had happened to them which actually cut across, shattered their sense of identity. And in its place came what I called a shadow identity. So somebody who thought they were valued, in their story that they were telling me, it became, I'm worthless. Somebody who saw themselves as being a professional, the story they were now telling was, I'm a charlatan, I'm nothing, I'm not the professional I thought I was. Somebody who thought they were loved, one of the people I worked with, described himself in terms of how he was loved by his teams. And then something happened which clearly, where the story was, he'd been betrayed by his team. Somebody who thinks they're a good parent, they lose their resilience because something happens which seems to be saying to them, you're a failed parent. Someone who has an identity of being healthy and fit becomes ill, and they take on an identity of being diseased. So for me, when I was doing my work with my clients, the work was trying to understand what is the identity that this event has shattered, and it was that was causing them to lose resilience. And therefore the work was in how to help them to find other identities which would help them move back into that resilient place. So, and you'll see there. So let me just stop there, because I just want to make sure we've got some time for Q&As before we round up. So I've given you sort of three sort of positions about resourcing, reusing, and working with narrative. So I'm just wondering where you might want to have a conversation for the next 5 minutes before we round things off. Anyone want to talk to me? Or leave me alone up here? Anything you want to come back on, or contribute to, or challenge? Yeah. Well, it's just about that in the process of telling, because there's two things about narrative. One is the writing of it. And obviously, when the person's writing it, they're writing it primarily for themselves. And then there's the telling of it. And then when you tell your story, you've got, in a coach, you've got this really interested, engaged listener. You're not going to have a better listener. And so the story becomes richer when you tell it to a coach, because the coach will do the tell me more. And wow, the language you're using that's really interesting. And so in the process of having the conversation and listening to the story, often for the client, it became visible to them why they were reacting in the way they were. Whereas when they were in the middle of it and just living, it wasn't. They weren't saying, I'm betrayed or I'm unloved. But actually when they started to listen to themselves telling the story, they were able to start saying, I'm frightened, right? I'm frightened or I'm betrayed. And so it sort of made visible, and therefore it allowed for a sort of honesty about what the work was in terms of moving things forward. Yeah. Anything else?
Just in terms of the coping strategies.
Yeah.
Talking about it's almost like symbols sometimes. Like
Yeah.
symbols you have around you that give you your identity.
Yeah.
From wherever that might be.
What are you thinking of?
Maybe other people might not even know you have them.
Yeah.
For you, they're your identity.
Their identity, yeah.
I don't know. It may be like something that helps you associate with that other part of you.
Okay, yeah. So
You're
you're not
not this one thing.
this one thing, this other thing. Yeah, and which is sometimes why things like pictures, so saying to someone, choose an image that captures how you want to be, or who you think you really are, or the other self, can be really powerful. Yeah, I agree with you. Okay. Anything?
I'm interested in the sort of potential limitations when you're in individual coaching.
Yeah.
And actually what you're really working with is a systemic cultural, malaise and very poor attitude around people's well-being.
Yeah.
And work on the impact of unreasonable workloads. So the limitations, because actually on an individual coaching basis, they're in a system which is impacting them. And there's limitations there about how you can really support them.
I think you're right. I think we are in that, all that classic stuff about what can you control. And the truth is, sometimes people do not have control, and we're just working in that thing of what can you influence. But let's acknowledge that this isn't all about you. This isn't because you're not a good enough time manager and you're not a good enough, actually there's something systemic, which is why I said context. I think it's really important to look at context. But that's not a reason for not wanting to see how well we can resource the individual. But I think it's really important for them to understand it's not all about them.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting. I'm just wondering whether you think we're a less resilient society now than we were, say, 7 years ago.
7 years ago.
70.
70 years ago. Well, when you look at your grannies and your mums, I've often thought that, and I don't know if you've had the, people who've lived through, the war and all those things and had to make do and mend and had to, I suspect that we, because of we've been born in a very blessed time, I think. If you think about what's happening in other parts of the world, they have to be enormously resilient. We haven't been tested in the way that previous generations were tested.
I found one part of your negative influence, which was poverty. I found that a surprise to see it as a negative influence, given the relative poverty of 70 years ago.
Well, I think what is poverty? I mean, I put it up there because I think in really to say if you have multiple deprivations, if you have poverty and inadequate support and all of those things, many of us. I mean, I grew up in a very poor household. There was, I realise now, but you don't realise as a kid that you were growing up in poverty, but absolute emotional stability. So you never felt that was going to hold you back. But if you've got all of those things acting against you without some of the balancing, then it's very hard to be resourced to go out into the world. Yeah. Okay. Other thoughts? Okay. So let me just round things off then, just do two things. One is just to summarize what we've been talking about. It's largely learned, and we develop it more and more over our lifespan. So there is research showing the older you get, the more resilient you get, which is comforting to some of us in the room. Resilience in terms of our work with clients is about learning, how we can help them to learn so that they can move forward. It's not just bounce back. I think the point you made about context is important, and I think it's important that we recognise that when we're working with clients. It isn't all down to them. And I think our work is in helping to resource the resilience gaps, whether that's, you know, giving them the toolkit, reusing what they trust, or supporting them to reauthor. But I just wanted to finish by reading you part of a poem by the Bangladeshi poet Tagore, who lived in the sort of early 20th century. And he wrote this about resilience. Let me not pray to be sheltered from dangers, but to be fearless in facing them. Let me not beg for the stilling of my pain, but for the heart to conquer it. Let me not look for allies in life's battlefield, but to my own strength. Let me not crave in anxious fear to be saved, but hope for the patience to win my freedom. Grant me that I may not be a coward, but let me find the grasp of your hand in my failure. And I think that often as coaches, we are the grasp in the hand whilst they need it in order that they can stand up again and move forward. So I leave you with that thought. Thank you. Or I'll do the plug. If by any chance you are interested in resilience coaching, there are some copies of the book at the back. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carol. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Right, so we're in the final few moments of the day. I can't possibly